Welcome. If you're joining us today, you probably already know the basics of joint support. You're not really looking for a beginner's summary.
Right, you're looking for the mechanics behind the curtain.
Exactly. In this deep dive, we're taking a comprehensive stack of research and distilling it down into the most essential, fascinating insights. We do the heavy lifting so you can just listen and, walk away with a nuanced understanding of a surprisingly complex topic.
We want to give you a shortcut through all that information overload. The goal is to really provide the context and the underlying systems that completely change how you look at the products you interact with every single day.
And today's focus is just a perfect example of that hidden complexity. We're looking at a 2026 guide by Laurent Fabian. He's the founder of the wellness innovator group Ingredientsage.
Yeah, the guide is titled Natural Source Glucosamine, a comprehensive guide to shellfish, plant-based options, and safety.
Which is a mouthful. But if you're taking glucosamine, you already understand the baseline biological intent, right? Supporting cartilage and joint health. But today, we're bypassing the basic biology entirely. We're looking directly at the modern supply chain.
Because most consumers just check the milligrams on the front label and, toss the bottle right into their cart.
Right.
But behind that dosage is an intricate, highly regulated global supply chain. There's intensive industrial extraction, cutting-edge microbiology, and shifting international trade laws, all dictating what actually ends up in that capsule.
So our mission today is to explore how the source of your supplement, whether it's extracted from a crustacean shell or cultivated in a high-tech algae reactor, how that radically alters its safety profile, its environmental footprint, and its market value. We're going to decode the label on the back of the bottle.
We're going to help you decode the massive scientific effort that happens before the product ever reaches the shelf.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the sheer scale of the traditional glucosamine supply chain is staggering. I mean, the heavyweight champion of this industry has historically been the shellfish-derived source.
Absolutely. For decades, crustacean byproducts have been the absolute standard.
We're talking about an extraction process that relies heavily on the byproducts of the global seafood industry. Shrimp, crab, lobster shells sourced from wild capture fisheries, and massive aquaculture operations.
But transforming a literal mountain of discarded shrimp shells into a highly purified dietary supplement requires a gritty, heavily industrialized process.
It's not pretty.
No, not at all. To isolate the glucosamine salts, manufacturers have to put those shells through two aggressive chemical phases. The first is demineralization.
Because the shells are basically just armor, right?
Exactly. Crustacean shells get their rigid structure from a very high concentration of calcium carbonate. So to break that down, the shells are essentially put through an acid bath to chemically strip the calcium away.
Wow. And once the structure is broken down, they move to the most critical phase, which the guide calls deproteination.
Right. This is where they have to systematically eliminate all the residual proteins from the shell material.
And the guide makes it incredibly clear that this isn't just about purity for the sake of quality. It's a massive safety hurdle. Because if you have a shellfish allergy, your immune system is reacting to those specific crustacean proteins.
Precisely. If the deproteination process isn't flawless, if there's even a microscopic trace of protein left behind, the resulting supplement becomes a severe risk to the consumer.
Which is terrifying when you think about mass production.
The cross-contact risk alone keeps quality assurance managers up at night. These proteins can easily contaminate other seemingly safe products if a facility uses shared manufacturing equipment.
Right.
What's fascinating here is how vulnerable this entire traditional supply chain actually is when you look at the logistics. Because this method relies on commercial fishing and aquaculture, the raw material pipeline is entirely subject to the rhythms of nature.
Meaning you're dealing with strict seasonal changes in crustacean harvesting.
Exactly.
Which means the availability of those raw shells just peaks and plummets depending on the time of year. And that seasonal variability directly impacts the lot-to-lot consistency of the final glucosamine powder.
Not to mention the massive fluctuations in raw material costs for the manufacturers. It introduces a massive headache for the brands trying to formulate a consistent product year-round.
So how do they even manage that?
To manage the raw material variations and mitigate those severe allergen risks, brands are forced to implement incredibly strict supplier verification systems. They require validated, meticulously documented cleaning protocols that are just non-negotiable.
Everything has to be spotless.
Every single piece of machinery must be aggressively scrubbed and tested. And the incoming shells have to be rigorously screened for heavy metals and microbiological contaminants that might have been picked up in the ocean.
Which sounds incredibly expensive.
It is an exhaustingly expensive process just to maintain baseline product safety.
Which perfectly explains why the industry is aggressively investing in new methodologies. The guide highlights the rise of these clean label challengers. We're seeing a massive shift toward vegan alternatives, driven by two distinct technological pathways.
The first of which is the plant microbial.
Right, which utilizes fungal fermentation. So instead of relying on seasonal fishing fleets, microbiologists are using specific non-animal organisms to synthesize glucosamine from scratch.
It's a brilliant pivot away from the ocean.
It really is. The guide mentions feeding these microbes nitrogen-rich substrates in highly optimized fermentation conditions. To put that into perspective for you listening, they're essentially placing these fungal strains into large commercial bioreactors.
And feeding them specialized nutrient broths.
Like plant-derived sugars or agricultural byproducts, so the microbes can just naturally produce the compound.
This fungal fermented route has incredible clean label appeal, which aligns perfectly with current consumer demands. Because the process starts with a microbe and a plant-based substrate, rather than a shrimp shell, the risk of introducing direct shellfish allergens is completely eliminated at the source.
But the guide is careful to point out that it isn't a completely risk-free utopia either.
No, definitely not. The manufacturing facilities producing this vegan glucosamine often process other materials, meaning they still have to rigorously manage cross-contact with other potential allergens like soy or wheat.
Even with those facility considerations, though, the marketing advantage is huge. Brands utilizing fungal fermentation can offer a level of process transparency that the seafood industry simply cannot match.
They can tell you exactly which microbial strain was selected,
The precise parameters of the fermentation environment.
and the specific purification methods used. Traceability really is the currency of the modern supplement market.
It is.
But the second vegan challenger highlighted in the guide takes that environmental control to an entirely different level. We're talking about the algal-based route.
I found the mechanics of this completely fascinating. We're talking about cultured algae being grown in massive closed-loop photobioreactors. I mean, I've bought joint supplements for my own knee pain in the past, and I never once pictured a high-tech, glowing algae farm when I looked at the bottle.
It sounds like science fiction, but the engineering behind those closed reactors is what solves the biggest vulnerabilities of the traditional supply chain.
Because you control everything.
Right. When you cultivate algae in a closed system, you dictate every single variable. You control the exact spectrum of light, the ambient temperature, and the precise flow of nutrients down to the microgram.
You completely bypass the seasonal fishing shifts.
And the risks of heavy metal pollution from the ocean.
And the unpredictable yields of wild harvests.
Exactly. Manufacturers get an incredibly consistent, pure supply of raw material every single time.
For you listening, if you're evaluating your own environmental impact, this algal route changes the entire sustainability narrative of your supplement routine. Because these are closed, vertical or horizontal reactors, they require a fraction of the land use compared to traditional agriculture.
And they remove the industrial pressure from already stressed marine ecosystems.
And according to the data in Fabian's guide, this specific algal extraction process even boasts a significantly lower greenhouse gas footprint when compared to the conventional sugar derivation routes often used in other synthetic manufacturing.
The environmental credentials are pristine, but operating advanced, closed-loop bioreactors and executing the specialized purification steps required to extract the glucosamine from the algae, that requires immense capital investment.
The overhead has to be massive.
It is. The production scale is still catching up to the traditional shellfish industry. So if you want a product with those immaculate, organic, highly sustainable credentials, you need to expect a premium price point at the pharmacy counter.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because whether the raw material was hauled up in a crab net, fermented by a fungus, or grown in an algae reactor, the final extraction process ultimately yields glucosamine in the form of salts.
That's right.
When you read the labels, you're primarily going to see two distinct types, glucosamine sulfate and glucosamine hydrochloride. And looking at the biochemistry detailed in the research, the difference actually matters.
It matters quite a bit.
The sulfate form provides sulfur, which is a fundamental building block for the cartilage matrix itself, whereas the hydrochloride form acts more as a different chemical delivery vehicle for the glucosamine.
The choice of salt alters the entire pharmacokinetic profile of the supplement. When we talk about a standard clinical dosage of 1,200 to 1,500 milligrams per day, the absorption rates between the two salts are generally comparable over long-term consistent use.
But the specific salt heavily influences the formulation process itself.
Exactly. It changes the gastric stability, meaning how effectively the compounds survive the highly acidic environment of your stomach before reaching the intestines.
It changes the solubility rate in the body.
It even dictates the physical mechanics on the manufacturing line. Things like how well the raw powder compresses and binds together to form a solid, stable tablet that won't degrade sitting on the shelf.
And the guide introduces a fantastic industry metric regarding these new vegan salts. They call it the Murky Day Bioavailability Standard.
I love that term.
It's great. When a brand formulates a cutting-edge fungal or algal glucosamine, they can't just rely on the environmental marketing. They are required to prove that their new vegan supplement delivers the exact same real-world, everyday absorption and efficacy as the decades-old Shellfish products.
The advanced formulas have to perform just as well in your body on Random Tuesday as the traditional standard.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, wait, let me rephrase that.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the ultimate question is how well any of these forms actually perform once they're absorbed. We've detailed the incredible industrial and biological engineering required to produce a 1,500 milligram dose.
But evaluating the actual clinical outcomes requires a clear-eyed look at the latest medical consensus.
Right.
Looking at the systematic reviews cited in the guide, I was struck by how mixed the efficacy data truly is. The research shows a modest improvement in joint symptoms for certain populations dealing with osteoarthritis. But the disease-modifying effects, meaning the ability of the supplement to actually halt joint degradation or rebuild lost cartilage, those remain highly uncertain.
The clinical data is incredibly heterogeneous across different studies.
Why is it so all over the place?
The heterogeneity in the data stems from variations in the specific salt forms used in different trials, the varying severity of osteoarthritis in the patient populations, and just differences in study design over the decades.
So it's hard to compare apples to apples.
Exactly. While a significant subset of patients report noticeable subjective symptom relief and improved mobility, the objective radiographic evidence for structural joint rebuilding just isn't definitive.
Yeah.
Patient response is highly individualized.
If you're currently taking glucosamine or considering adding it to your routine, the main takeaway from the 2026 data is to actively manage your expectations.
Yes.
The consensus views this supplement as a supportive adjunct. It's one specific tool within a much broader, comprehensive joint health strategy that should include physical therapy, weight management, and targeted exercise. It isn't a standalone cure that will structurally rebuild a damaged knee.
Viewing it as a long-term supportive measure rather than an acute fix is the most scientifically sound approach. And because consumers are taking these supplements daily over the course of years, the regulatory oversight governing how these bottles are labeled and marketed has become a major flashpoint.
This raises an important question about international law because the regulatory landscape in 2026 is deeply fractured. If we look at the divide between the United States and the European Union, they treat the exact same glucosamine compound with entirely different regulatory philosophies.
They really do.
In the U.S., it's classified and regulated strictly as a dietary supplement. The framework heavily restricts brands. They cannot make explicit disease modification claims without undergoing the grueling process of securing regulator-approved pharmaceutical evidence.
The U.S. operates under a framework that leans heavily on the free market, provided the products are safe and the claims are sufficiently caveated. You'll see language about supporting joint health or promoting flexibility, always accompanied by the standard disclaimer that the FDA has not evaluated the statements.
So the burden is largely on the consumer to interpret the marketing.
Yes, but the European Union takes a completely different historical approach to preventative health and supplements. Over there, glucosamine falls under stringent food supplement directives.
Which means?
The EU authorities mandate incredibly rigorous proactive controls on the actual composition of the product before it hits the shelf, and they maintain a highly restrictive, pre-approved list of authorized health claims.
A brand simply cannot promise a physiological benefit in Europe unless the central regulatory authority has already vetted and authorized that specific claim.
The EU model prioritizes upfront validation, but regardless of whether a brand is navigating the US or European markets, the ultimate driver of change in 2026 is the end consumer.
The guide makes it clear that label clarity is no longer an optional marketing perk.
Not at all. Consumers are demanding explicit, granular disclosure. They expect the packaging to clearly state the exact biological origin, whether that's shellfish, fungal, or algal.
They want the specific salt form identified.
And they require unambiguous allergen statements and verifiable third-party safety certifications prominently displayed.
The push for radical transparency has completely revolutionized product packaging. One of the most fascinating market trends detailed for 2026 is the widespread integration of dynamic QR codes directly onto the supplement bottles.
This is a huge shift.
As a consumer, you can scan the product while standing in the pharmacy aisle, and it instantly links you to the specific batch's certificate of analysis, or COA. You get immediate access to the supplier's facility audits, the heavy metal screening results, and the third-party allergen tests. It totally demystifies the entire global supply chain right there on your phone.
It forces a level of accountability that the industry has historically lacked. You're no longer taking the brand's word for it. You're looking at the raw laboratory data for the exact pills in your hand.
That demand for verifiable data is fundamentally altering the business landscape as well.
Retailers and private label distributors are abandoning the old model of piecing together cheap raw materials from multiple opaque international brokers. They are aggressively shifting toward one-stop manufacturing partners.
Because they need specialized facilities capable of providing end-to-end quality assurance, independent microbiological testing, and highly scalable vegan formulations.
Exactly. The goal is to bring a premium, fully traceable product to market without the liability of a fragmented supply chain.
So what does this all mean? Let's recap the terrain we've covered today.
It's been a lot.
The next time you pick up a joint supplement, you understand that the origin of the raw material dictates the entire profile of the product. If it's crustacean-derived, it carries the logistical baggage of seasonal fishing harvests and the rigorous processing required to mitigate severe allergen risks.
And if it's fungal fermented or cultivated in closed-loop algal reactors, it offers a remarkably clean, highly sustainable, and traceable alternative, albeit often at a premium price.
You know that the specific chemistry, whether it's a sulfate or hydrochloride salt, impacts how the tablet is manufactured and how it interacts with your digestive system.
And you understand that while the clinical data supports modest symptom relief, glucosamine is an adjunct tool for long-term support, governed by vastly different marketing laws depending on your hemisphere.
If you take a practical application away from this deep dive, let it be a change in how you evaluate your daily routines. Reading a label is no longer just a quick check of the active milligrams.
The tools exist in 2026 to demand absolute supply chain transparency. Look for the explicit origin of the ingredients. Verify the third-party testing certifications, scan the QR codes, and look at the batch data. You have the leverage to ensure that the supplements you take not only meet your biological needs, but also align with your standards for environmental sustainability and safety.
You have the data to make an informed choice. Which leaves me with one final lingering thought for you to chew on as we wrap up.
Let's hear it.
We just explored how cutting-edge microbiologists using closed-loop algae reactors and fungal fermentation can perfectly synthesize complex, historically crustacean-derived compounds. They're doing it with a fraction of the environmental footprint, zero seasonal vulnerability, and absolutely no animal byproducts. So what other traditional animal-derived vitamins or ubiquitous medications sitting in your medicine cabinet right now are primed for a total microbiological takeover?
The infrastructure is already being built.
Right.
Glucosamine is just the proof of concept for a much larger shift in how we source our health.
Keep asking those questions, keep reading the fine print on the back of the bottle, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.